Liberalism section. The Penal Code, Formation of a Compulsory Workforce, and the Process of Colonization. The problem of military recruitment is thus understandable. Prisons were rummaged for malefactors. The profession of soldier, observed Defoe, above all devolved on, quote, men taken from the gallows. Fortunately, there were plenty of them. From 1688 to 1820, the number of crimes carrying the death penalty increased from 50 to between 200 and 250, and they were almost always crimes against property. While attempted homicide was regarded as a petty crime until 1803, the theft of a shilling or handkerchief, or the illegal clipping of an ornamental bush, could entail hanging, and one could be consigned to the hangman even at the age of 11. In fact, in some cases, even young children ran this risk. In 1833, the death penalty was pronounced on a pickpocket of 9, although the sentence was subsequently commuted. Even more significant than the increase in penalties was the criminalization of behavior that had hitherto been licit. The enclosure and private appropriation of common land underwent significant development, and the peasant or commoner who was late in appreciating the new situation became a thief, a criminal to be visited with all the force of the law. This might seem an arbitrary and brutal way to behave, but that is not what Locke thought. In legitimizing the colonists' appropriation of land theft uncultivated by the Indians, the Second Treatise of Government simultaneously adopted a clear position in favor of enclosure in England. Quote, in the beginning, all the world was America. And common land was a kind of vestige in this original wild state, which work, private appropriation, and money had subsequently overcome. It was a process that manifested itself on a large scale across the Atlantic, but which was not unknown in England. Quote, even amongst us, land that is left wholly to nature, that hath no improvement of pasturage, tillage, or planting, is called, as indeed it is, waste, end quote, until enclosure and private appropriation intervened positively. Along with the despoliation of the Indians and English peasants, Locke also justified terroristic legislation in defense of property. It was, quote, lawful for a man to kill a thief who has not in the least hurt him, nor declared any design upon his life, any farther than by the use of force, so to get him in his power as to take away his money or what he pleases from him. End quote. This was only a petty crime in appearance. In reality, the guilty party, if only momentarily, had deprived his victim of his, quote, right to liberty, and had made him a, quote, slave. At this point, no one could exclude the possibility that theft would not be followed by homicide, since it was precisely the power of life and death that defined the relationship of slavery. This was synonymous with a state of war, and hence there was no reason why the thief should not be done to death, whatever the extent of the theft. What Locke seems to be saying is that at stake is not only the shilling or the handkerchief or whatever rather minor stolen good. Private property as such, and, over and above it, liberty, were in danger. Thus, what legitimized the pickpocket's killing or execution is the same liberal pathos that had presided over the condemnation of monarchical despotism as the source of political slavery. In addition to common land, even birds and wild animals became objects of private appropriation by the landed aristocracy. In this instance, it was not possible to appeal to Locke. In fact, on the basis of his theory, not having been transformed by labor, birds and wild animals should have been regarded as common property. And yet, in accordance with legislation enacted after the Glorious Revolution, while the peasant slid into the condition of thief, the hunter was transformed into poacher, and here too the terrorism of the penal code was called on to compel respect for the incursion. As with the slavery and trading of blacks, the vulgar historicist explanation does not stand up when it comes to the expansion in crimes against property and the increased severity of the penalties provided for them. It is misleading to refer to the spirit of the times. Quote, it is very doubtful whether any other country possessed a criminal code with anything like so many capital provisions as there are in this single statute." End quote. The ruthless character of English legislation was already proverbial on its enactment. While Napoleon exercised his iron rule over France, a reformer like Sir Samuel Romilly felt compelled to offer a bitter observation. Quote, "There is probably no other country in the world in which so many and so great a variety of human actions are punishable with loss of life as in England." End quote. Still, at the beginning of the 19th century, Hegel denounced the, quote, draconian severity whereby, quote, "every thief in England is hanged," in an absurd equation of life and property, of the two, quote, "qualitatively different" crimes that were homicide and theft. The class origins of such draconian severity were even identified. For peasants guilty of illegal hunting, quote, "the harshest and most disproportionate punishments were provided, because those who made those laws, and who are now sitting in the courts as magistrates and jurors," end quote, were the aristocracy, the very class that held a monopoly on hunting. The need to maintain law and order was only one aspect of the problem. Not infrequently, those sentenced to death, or even a long prison term, saw their sentence commuted to deportation to the colonies. Already in force for some time, from 1717, the practice of deportation assumed an official character in significant proportions. So, following the Glorious Revolution, we witness, on the one hand, the enactment of terroristic legislation, and, on the other, the burgeoning phenomenon of deportation to remote colonies. Is there a link between the two events? It is difficult to deny that the formation of a large compulsory workforce through drastic harshening of the legal code ultimately made it possible to satisfy, quote, "the labor needs of plantations." On the other hand, underlying this practice was a specific theory. Locke repeatedly demanded penal slavery for those who made an attempt on another person's life or property. Already in the state of nature, quote, "the damnified person has this power of appropriating to himself the goods or service of the offender." Things were even clearer in the social state. Beginning of long quote. "Indeed, having by his fault forfeited his own life by some act that deserves death, he to whom he has forfeited it may, when he has him in his power, delay to take it, and make use of him to his own service, and he does him no injury by it. For, whenever he finds the hardship of his slavery outweigh the value of his life, it is in his power, by resisting the will of his master, to draw on himself the death he desires." End quote. The theory of the colonial war as just war on the part of Europeans, and the theory of penal slavery legitimized and galvanized the deportation, respectively, of the black slaves and white semi-slaves required by colonial development. On the eve of the American Revolution, in Maryland alone, there were 20,000 servants of criminal origin. To put the point with Samuel Johnson, they were, quote, "a race of convicts, and ought to be content with anything we may allow them short of hanging." End quote. And that is how an inexhaustible source of forced labor was fed. End of section.